Good. So they missed everything I just said. I also wonder how they would hook you up. Sort of a matrix kind of chunk, 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 chunk. Okay. There's a couple other analogies that she has made that were in the same paper. Let me pull this away for a second. And I want to go through them because some of them I think are literally a little bizarre. But it's useful to think, if the world was different, how do we treat it? Let's go with people seeds. That's the diagram someone made once for people seeds. Pretend that we don't gestate humans in the way that you're familiar with mammals, but we're more like trees. Our sperm and egg float on the wind. People get covered in it. Just so you're aware, if you're outside and you're like under a tree and all its petals and pollen's falling on you, it's gametes, sperm and egg, are just literally raining down upon you. That's what that means. Instead, these little fertilized bits just float on the breeze like a seed, and they can implant themselves anywhere. Now, it needs a warm place to grow, so they tend to implant themselves inside of houses. Pretend people seeds drift about in the air like pollen. If you open your windows, one may drift in and take root in your carpets or the upholstery. You don't want children. Once a child grows in your house, apparently you're responsible for it. So you fix up your windows with fine mesh screens, the very best you can buy. But as can happen on rare occasions, one of the screens is defective and a seed drifts in and takes root. Are you allowed to uproot it? Now, I don't know what this seed would look like. Probably some weird growing fleshy thing with like veins all over it, sucking nutrients somehow from the floor. I like the science fiction analogy of this. In this example, what are the screens representing? Contraception. So this would be an example in which we have someone who is being prudent. They are using contraception. They have no intention of getting pregnant. If this happens, it's an accident. If you have open windows, of course, that means that you're having sex, but you've put mesh screens there, so you're trying to do it. Nobody likes living in a house with closed windows. The other one we did, if a woman has taken all reasonable precautions against getting pregnant, I won't go to the other one just yet, she is not responsible for the presence of any fetus that might result from intercourse. Now, this is something Thompson would say even when a woman voluntarily indulges in intercourse. She is addressing this in the 70s. Keep in mind, up until the 1960s, you could still commit your wife to a mental asylum if she was insane, based on the word of a doctor and the husband. So she is working in an area where rights were not quite as forward-thinking. And one of the common charges would be, well, if you didn't want to have an abortion, you shouldn't get pregnant. Leaving aside for the moment that the biology means that all of the responsibility falls on one side, it does fall on one side. That seems to be an untenable position to take. To say for one half of humanity, you can never engage in this unless you're willing to take all of the risks that might occur from that. So this deals with the voluntary nature, but only in the part where she's taken all reasonable precautions. This is also used to suggest this is the need for contraception. How many of you know where you could get condoms in the house if you needed to from, say, your house parent? Yeah. There's just a box? There's sex prefects. I like the name sex prefect. Mason? Yeah, yeah. So we appoint those. Apparently, there's a couple houses that don't. They're available to all the houses, and if you don't know, you can also go to the health center. You can get the morning after pill over the counter, regardless of age, from any pharmacy, I believe, in Canada, in terms of the law. Because one of the things that she was trying to really point home is that if you are against abortion, then you must be really, really for contraception. Because if it's impossible to take contraception, then like if screens aren't available, how can they be at fault if seeds are blowing in? And so this was to do the analogy to really emphasize that we need access to contraception in order to make this a tenable position. Because if we make it very difficult to do. I've had the argument in house parent meetings. There's been the proposals from parents and others before that we should remove the condoms from all of the houses, and we should not hand them out to students. They're not allowed to have them. Because that, of course, means if you have access to condoms, everybody will just have more sex, and we're encouraging bad behavior among students. Because you have never thought about it until you saw the condom. I did have to speak to our sex prefect year before, because he took a whole bunch of them and then pinned them to the wall, like right through the middle of them. He did that as a joke, but then someone took one of them, and we had to like do a little announcement, like that one has a hole in it. Never take one that's had a thumbtack driven through. That's not necessarily a good idea. So it does, in our culture, have this tension between access to ensure that people are behaving prudently, so that we can justify that, we decrease the amount of abortions. Two, there is the thought that just having access to things means that you're more likely to do them. Clearly, if we had condoms in this room right now and drugs, it would turn into just a huge rave right away, and would be terrible. You're all barely in control as it is. Terrible people. So, that is the last example. Wanted to mostly just make you aware of it. It is a famous paper. It works well. I think the analogy, since everybody has had, I think through Brentwood, some version of consent and sex education, and all the advertising campaigns, is that consent needs to be ongoing. But this is something I do find that people do have trouble with. If you have agreed to something, you are allowed to stop agreeing to it at any point. So, for example, if I come to you and I say, Eustace, you haven't handed in your essay yet, so I think you're on drugs. Exactly. Follow me. We're going to go to the health center right now. We're going to drug test you. Now, you've all signed a form that allows that to happen. You've given up your right to say no. Can you say no? Yeah, you can. You don't. Mr. Sullivan's right there saying you have to take the drug test. You can say, no, I'm not going to. No, you can't get expelled. It's not an expellable offense to not take a drug test. However, they can decide to withdraw you from the school. But that's technically not expelled. Now, there are students who have definitely done that. In fact, there are students who we know they are telling us that's what we're doing. Like, well, look, I've been caught. I'm not going to say, but the parents decide to withdraw them from the school because they don't want that on any kind of record that they failed a drug test. Particularly with crossing borders, sometimes they're a little worried about that and what can happen, and so they're like, no. But just because you signed away all of your rights, you could stop dressing in your number ones and dailies right now. Just dress however you want. You agreed to do that when you're here, and it's part of the ongoing agreement to stay here. It just means eventually we might ask you not to come back after a break. It would take a lot for something as silly as dress. But it has happened where a student has just sort of decided. We have the grade 12s in assembly. I wonder if I think it happened. I wasn't in assembly this Thursday because I was away for an appointment. But I think they had it after this one where they essentially tell all the 12s, look, you're really close to graduating. Don't do something stupid. Go to your classes. Because they can taste the fact that they're graduating. June is like right there, and they're done with high school forever. And you get this thing that we call senioritis or grade 12itis, in which they just go, I don't want to sit in class anymore. I can't take it. And if you stop going to classes, the school just goes, oh, okay, go home. You cannot go to classes at home. There's no point in being here. And that's happened to a couple of grade 12s. They just stopped doing all the things. They just kind of like, anybody seen the movie Office Space? There's a scene in it where the guy goes, I'm not going to go to work tomorrow. He goes, oh, you're going to quit? No, I'm just not going to go to work. He doesn't show up for a couple days. He then shows up late. He just does whatever he wants. When you get to that point, the only option the school has is like, look, you got to go home. We can't have you here doing that. Sets a bad example to the students. Everybody's really engaged. We can't have people following up with your absences all the time. It's just way too much work. Go home. But you're not. You can always choose to do that and get the consequences. The consequences, if you've agreed to do something, might be that the other person is like, oh, you agreed to do this. I wanted to continue. Yeah, but I don't want to do it anymore. Okay. As they show the T example, I'm sure, every single year when they do sex ed. You've seen the T for consent film.
Person doesn't want tea, don't give them.
Yeah. They don't want T. I've not seen a rapid nods. Like, it's been used every year for like the last decade. Okay. Clearly, we have to see the T example for consent. I don't show it anymore because I just assumed everybody had seen it so much they'd be sick of it.
Yeah. They showed it every year in last week.
Yeah. How many of you have not seen it?
If you're still struggling with consent.
Okay. Yeah. That's enough. That's enough. We'll watch the consent T. I will remind me to turn the live stream back on for sound. because then I can say that I reinforced the health center things in my class, and Ms. Decker will be very proud of me. In areas of fault, we have not recognized the ability to use someone else's body without consent. In fact, there are places in the world where they have, and they are routinely condemned for doing so. It's considered an international crime. One of the criticisms and charges, and I don't know if it's true, but in the, I can't pronounce the name, the Muslim population in China that apparently, say it? Uyghur? Did I say that right? One of the charges that they said was happening is some of them were being executed in order to harvest their organs, or just removing a kidney because they wanted to use it for someone else. Even if they had committed a crime, that would be itself be considered a separate crime. There is no point in which we recognize in ethics, even using prisoners who've committed heinous acts, do we consider that we should be able to harvest their organs and take them away? There's a few. Larry Niven wrote a few sci-fi stories. He's fairly dated now. A good sort, if you can find him, from the 70s and 80s, in which he diagrams an entire society in which actually this does occur. So if you commit murder, you have given up the right to your organs. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to take them. But if they find someone with a match, one of the ways you can make up for your crime is donating your heart to someone else. In this particular society, they're far enough in the future that they've solved the problem of organ matching. And so actually your organs can be donated to anybody. So anybody that needs them. So if you've never committed a crime, you get your organs from people who have committed crimes. And gradually in the society, they just make more and more crimes capital offenses. To the point that if you disobey a traffic law, you're now on the list for donating your organs because you put other people's lives in danger. So if you were speeding, someone might need your lung someday. If you no longer have bodily autonomy, it is really easy to move that line over and start being able to use other people's organs. And given power balances that exist in society, upper class versus lower class, gender disparities, when we have had this type of, if we don't have these autonomy protections, often it goes badly for people who are not in the ruling class. Even if a person initially had consent, so the pregnancy started, the mother's uncertain, maybe I do want to have it, there is an inherent risk that's ongoing. With the famous violinist we had, is it going to be a danger when they unhook it? Pregnancy itself has ongoing health risks. An abortion has a health risk of the surgery, and the termination of pregnancy by giving birth, by delivering, is itself a health risk. I have apparently scared sometimes to the point, one year when I taught Biology 12, apparently 3/4 of Alex House decided they were never going to have kids. So I'm not going to go through all of the details that can happen, but there are risk factors. Before the advent of modern medicine, even 19th century medicine was terrible. Often hospitals were even worse. The risk of infection, the kinds of things that can happen. We underwent a rapid evolution in which our heads grew very large, but the pelvises stayed roughly the same size. So getting a baby through the hole is itself a whole lot of work. And for any animal, making a new animal, the fact that half of humanity are essentially 3D printers is wild. You just print a human being, whoop, 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 and they just grow. And then you have to get it out. Any mammalian species, that's a difficult task, and humans it seems to be difficult as well. Before modern medicine, the risk to the mother, the highest risk of death was usually childbirth. Especially if you're going on to have, 12 babies. And so you have to evaluate those risks, and who is best to evaluate those risks.
So there's always going to be a risk with an abortion. There's no such thing as a safe abortion.
Well, it's a surgical procedure. There's always going to be risk. Now, that risk may be less than the risk of carrying it to term. But there is no matter what's going to happen, there it is. And I do want to be careful because I don't want to imply that pregnancy is a disease, despite the fact there's a parasite growing inside of you and sucking away all your resources. To the point, like if you don't eat enough calcium during your pregnancy, the fetus will suck it out of your very teeth and bones, and your teeth will fall out. That little thing wants everything, and it will suck it right out of you. Yeah. So, like, pregnancy has a risk. But any medical procedure has a risk. I mean, anytime you're going to have anything happen, if they're going to go in and do a surgical abortion, there's going to be a risk of infection and other things that happen in a hospital. There's always a risk for any procedure. And so the question is, who is best determined to make the decision of which procedure they get? No chorus of answers. Clearly, it should be the dad. That's why when there's like, oh, the birth isn't going well, they go to the dad and they ask, who do you want to survive, the mom or the child? You'll see that in old movies where like the birth isn't going well and they go to the dad, like it's not going well, so who should we save? And the dad would be like, I need my heir, so save the baby. Is it a boy? Yeah, okay, save the boy. Well, I'll get a new wife. There's lots of them available. And now, shocked faces around the room are regular. We have since decided that that's wrong, and which procedure you get should be up to the person whose body it is. Question?
So, back to the donating organs.
Yeah.
So, if someone violated a traffic law,
Mm-hmm.
then, like, while they're still alive, you can, like, take their lungs.
Oh, no, they actually put them in a special prison. They type them. They take their brain and spinal cord and put it in a section. Because what if it turns out later they're innocent? They could actually go and get new organs and give it back to them. And so they put them in a spot. They'll never be conscious again. And after like 50 years, they incinerate it. And then all their organs just get parted out. Yeah. So like your lungs will go to this person, your heart to that person, your liver there. Somebody's eyeballs, they don't want to get glasses. They just get new eyeballs. In his version, there's no such thing as organ rejection anymore. They managed to solve that problem. So organs essentially just became parts. Yeah. And if you have a society in which they don't respect autonomy in any absolute sense, like the society is allowed to say, well, you broke the law. And you can imagine in the society, how does this play out against non-ruling classes? So indigenous people in the society would probably be treated much worse. They're going to break more crimes and because they're going to be looked at by the police officers a lot more. And so the amount of inequity that he's writing about is what made it an interesting tale. Yes?
How many types of abortions are there? You said there's like surgical, so
Well, there's surgical, there's chemical, and so the morning after pill would be an example of a chemical abortion. You can also argue about what an abortion actually is, because there are some people that will say anytime you have a fertilized egg, then if it comes out, that's an abortion. Whereas if that's the case, then nature commits abortions all the time. Because a lot of times the egg will be fertilized and it just doesn't implant. So that's how chemical birth control works. So if you're taking a hormone, say you're on an estrogen, progesterone type of pill birth control, it kind of fools your body into thinking that you're already pregnant. Your oviducts become a little bit more mucousy so that the spermatozoa can't get to the egg as easily. And even if they do implant in the egg and the egg comes down, it doesn't implant into the wall. The wall's not very accepting of it because it thinks it's kind of already pregnant. And then those hormones mean that implantation doesn't occur and then it just gets all removed in the next menstruation cycle. Now, most biologists would define an abortion as after implantation has occurred. So it has implanted into the uterine cell wall and it has started to grow. And then at that point, nature is still the number one abortifacient. Because at that point, some people's bodies just go, yeah, I'm not ready for a baby right now. And it just goes away. You may never even know you were pregnant. In many cases, you don't. It just got rid of it and it just decided you weren't ready to be pregnant. If you are abusing your body in terms of the amount of food you're eating, often it is more difficult to get pregnant. And so, for example, the classes of people that would fall under would be ballerinas and gymnasts who go onto extreme diets to fit a particular form for a show, so they're doing a very strict dietary regime. Their body will think they're essentially starving and won't survive. They're in a famine right now, and so the chances of getting pregnant sometimes can be less. Now, that being said, I'm saying less, but like it kind of doesn't apply to you. Right now, you're probably the most fertile you'll ever be. Peaks like at 20, but you're like, your bodies like are just dying to be pregnant right now. Because right now is great because, you know, you're going to die. Evolutionary speaking, you're going to die when you're like in your 30s. So you need to have a kid now, raise them so you can be a grandparent by the time you're 37. Long-lived humans is still kind of, you know, it used to be kind of rare. If you survive past a certain point, the odds are you make it to maybe 60, but a lot of people died young too, diseases and other things. So being able to have children, evolutionary speaking, was a real advantage for a long time. So you're all prime right now. Over time in your lifetime, it will slowly decline your fertility, and those types of things will affect you more, but they still affect everybody a little bit. The rates you see if you look up different types of birth control in the pharmacy, if you get like pills versus condoms, they'll tell you the failure rates. Those are failure rates based on perfect use. And for the average person they've defined as someone in their 30s. So they go up if you're in your 20s and down if you're in your 40s, because they have to make a particular definition for that. So adjust those as needed. But if it's a surgical abortion, then that would involve going into the uterus and removing what's there and pulling it out.
There's just chemical and surgical?
Pardon?
There's just chemical and surgical?
Yeah. That doesn't mean they're cutting you. They're not going to open your abdomen or anything. It's not like a C-section. You weren't thinking that, were you? Okay. So yeah, either you physically remove it or you induce essentially an abortion by essentially inducing a miscarriage. And nature does that in early stages all the time as well. And those are really the only two ways. There is some male birth control on the market coming soon, but they keep abandoning it because they'll find out it has really bad side effects. Like the males who take it, you know, they end up being bloated and moody, and it makes them feel uncomfortable. And so they go, we clearly can't do that to the men, and so then it doesn't go past funding. And you may be thinking, those sound like exactly the side effects that happen with regular pill birth control to women. And the answer is, they are. However, the reason they don't get approved is because when you're approving drugs, the new drug always has to be better than the old one. So if we already have birth control for women, then the new drug can't have those same side effects for men, or it has to be less in order for it to be approved. Now, this works for many drugs because most drugs, if you have Tylenol, and everybody takes Tylenol for headaches, then any new drug they approve has to have less side effects than Tylenol, which makes sense. You don't want to approve something that's exactly the same. We already got one. We understand it. Why introduce something new? But when we have drugs that affect different people differently, that rule is now being questioned. If there was a drug that was a male birth control that just had the same side effects as the female one, maybe we should consider approving that, because then at least they have equality, and that would be a benefit in terms of a both utilitarian and deontological kind of way, so that it wasn't all on one half of humanity to maintain the birth control. And so they've questioned that, but the rules were set up for drugs that affect everybody, so they still affect. So if you're like, well, men are too wimpy, yeah, they kind of are, but at the same time, the drug has to be better, and they keep getting drugs that are just as bad as the original birth control. And so that's why we've had trouble getting one all the way to the end. It's not for a lack of volunteers. The men were blamed at one point. They couldn't find volunteers. And then when they heard about that, they got a ton of volunteers. So even if a person supplies consent to use the mother's body, even if that doesn't make sense, even if there is consent to use the mother's body's resources, the inherent risk requires ongoing consent. And this is from, I think, a university campaign that they put up around their campus about consent for all the new students that come. Consent is ongoing, consent is mandatory, and freely given. So consider the implication is not freely given. Mandatory, you can't just take silence as consent. You have to actually obtain the consent and find out what's going on. And people should be allowed to say stop. It has to be an ongoing process. When we apply that to issues such as abortion, then it really comes down to the person whose body it is, which is why much of that focuses in that direction. Now, if you define murder or killing such that any loss of life, regardless of who they're attached to, is bad, and that we should be able to use other people's bodies to keep more people alive, then you could definitely say abortion is not just up to the woman. We make laws against it. But then you should also consider other areas. If we tissue typed everybody in Canada, we could save a lot more lives. If I get into a car accident, and Angel, your kidneys match mine, you have 2 kidneys. You could get by with only one. And then we would both be alive. How could you say no? By saying no, you'd be killing me. And so we need to consider the implications if we make changes to bodily consent. And I don't see that discussed very much when it's discussed politically. Politically, it's focused on the act. Probably from historical reasons, we've controlled women's reproduction for a very long time, and society seems quite content to do that. But if you're talking about it ethically, we do want to see where that's going to go. Anything more, or are we done? This comes up. Father's rights. We've talked a long time, and I've just chalked. What are father's rights? So, a couple of scenarios. A person becomes pregnant, a person with a uterus, and their partner is really excited. They'd love to have a baby in their life. Person who with the uterus goes, no, I don't want to be pregnant. I'm scheduling an abortion. And they're like, no, I want the baby. You can give up all your parental rights. Give it to me. And they're like, no, I'm just going to schedule an abortion. Should they have any say in that matter? Can they force them to say, no, you must carry to term and then sign it over to me? Or father says, oh, you're pregnant, get an abortion. The person with the uterus goes, I can't. It could be religious belief. It could be they are scared of the procedure. It could be that they just want to have the baby. Father goes, fine, have the baby then. But I am no longer financially responsible. I am going to have and this is the term that's now been used in the media, financial abortion. Because you've said no to an abortion and I've offered to pay for it, and you said no to that, then I'm no longer financially financially responsible for the child. What would be the issues and stakeholders for those two questions? Let's put you into groups, and then I'll write out those questions in a better way. Nope. Dojo. Class dojo. Because there's something that happens to this. To be honest, all of this would go away if we would just make people seeds. Yeah, no, it's good. Let's say Stella and Orion, rather than a group of 2, because I want at least 3 people there, separately find different groups. So don't both go the same group. I don't want a group of 5. But there can be 2 groups of 4. Find your people. And I will make... And on the same document you had for this discussion, I put a new one at the top. And you can give your group a name. I think we're 4 groups. And so I'm going to put it. Father's rights usually comes down to 2 questions. That's weird. One. Mother wants an abortion. Father wants a child. And I'm using these as shorthand for uterus haver and partner. Just to be quick. Mother does not want an abortion. Father does not want responsibility. Financial responsibility. Ooh, I like that. Put your members in there. So the 2 different scenarios to consider, briefly summarized.
Is this for question number 1?
Number 1, sorry.
Should I make these A and B so that you can make your points 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you can refer to like situation A or B? Would that be helpful? I think I can do that with the numbering. There we go. Who's got the rover as their symbol?
There's something government related.
And it's just the same for number 2.
Yeah.
So
It's either you either get money or you pay us.
Are we deciding what we're thinking? Or is it just like,
So, considerations, questions, problems on the right. So what kind of questions would you have? What kind of details would make a difference? What are the issues? Who are the stakeholders on the left?
right?
should do attendance on the actual.
But it could also be the same for if she wants an abortion, then like should be held responsible for like if she wants an abortion, but like the father wants one, should she bring a child's care if she doesn't want it? Yeah, like I think that's a question.
Okay, Ella's not here.
Yeah, she should be held accountable.
Beatrice isn't here.
For a child she doesn't want.
Sloan,
Yeah.
you're here. It's you're not supposed to be queuing for a dance show right now.
No, it's not till like 4:30.
No.
Wait,
Whoever-
you're marked off for that?
You could have skipped every class today. Thank you for coming to class.
You're marked off for that?
Well, like on Wednesday, I'm like it starts at 1 and it goes to
Yeah, but
5.
like everybody who I know isn't marked off at all. Like they have to go to their other arts. Marked
No.
off for what?
Yeah, she told me I wouldn't be locked on. So shopping? Yeah, I guess like it means the same thing like that she should like find you like held accountable for something she doesn't want, or like the father like doesn't have like financial ability to take care of the child.
Paperwork. Paperwork for thing. You sound like Saturn. Like there was another school shooting. It was there's one every week. I know, but still.
Okay. Okay. Un Sloan Michelle, health risks. Does the father have to care for the child? Should the father wants for she should be able to come. Kevin has the right to his own money. Is the mother responsible for him if she wants an abortion? Interesting.
We have a ditch. We have a 2 foot. 2 foot.
Sperm. Yeah. Should have a. One thing is, if you've finished a little bit, one thing to consider, if you've put in there a list of problems, in the sections second 1B, in which the father is or is not going to pay money, if the father isn't, you do need to consider who is. Because if it's not the father, it's going to be the state, like as the government. There might be more resources taken from the community otherwise. So, impregator. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, basically. A big point of the cross. Get to this
Moral responsibility that another the father, if the father doesn't want the child, the mother has the child anyways, it would cost the mother more responsibility to do something.
But then wouldn't the mother have the same responsibility as the husband?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you end up
Because in the first thing people think is right.
Yeah,
Then you'll put up
yeah, the mother
these
has
others
more
to
responsibility to do
kids.
something.
But then really do that all the time. Just not so. That's the one just big guys that are nuts stuff.
Now, in the last couple of minutes, you can keep writing. I'm just going to let you know, because there's a Supreme Court ruling, since we talk about ethics and what happens in the law, that's very, in terms of autonomy, what the police are allowed to do. This has to do with DUIs, driving while under the influence, drinking and driving. The police have a fairly, in Canada especially, they can stop you at random, ask you to blow in a breathalyzer. If you have had the ability in the past, say someone reported on you that you were driving erratically to the point they suspected you were drunk, the police can actually breathalyze you in the comfort of your own home. So you could have driven home, walked into your front door, sat down, had a beer, the police show up and demand a breathalyzer. You're not in your car. But if they had received reports, now they can't do this randomly. They can't go to houses and just randomly test people to see if they've been drinking and say, aha, you were driving a car. But if they have reasonable suspicion that you were, they can come to your house and breathalyze you right there and then.
How does that apply to DUI?
Well, if you were driving and they can prove it, and it's within 2 hours afterwards, they can breathalyze you to say, oh, you were probably drunk while you were driving. Yeah. Yeah. So you could have come home and just started drinking right away, and then now you're in a real kettle of fish. This is a different one in which a person was driving an ATV on the highway, and the police were following them. They hadn't pulled them over or anything, and they're like, this is a little weird, someone driving an ATV on the highway. And the ATV pulled into his parents' house that he was visiting. The police officers pulled in after, and then on talking to him, realized he was quite inebriated. In fact, when they took him down to the station to get a blood sample to prove he's inebriated, they had to delay it because he threw up twice due to the amount of alcohol he drank. And so, absolutely, he was driving while drunk. But they didn't pull him over while he was on the highway, and they didn't have the suspicion until after he was on private property. So in the first case, if you were driving and someone reported you driving drunk, they have the evidence from before you entered your own property. So even though they can still come to your house and ask you for it, and by the way, this is like Canada only. The U.S. doesn't have a similar type of exception. Canada takes drunk driving very seriously. It is one of those things. His defense was, well, they weren't allowed to enter private property. They had no suspicion until they talked to me. Supreme Court just said, yes, they weren't allowed to go on. They do not have that right, and they did violate your charter rights. But we're going to restore the conviction because it's in the best interest not to have drunk people on the road, so you're still going to be charged with it. So the Supreme Court has gotten away with saying both of the same things at the same time. Oh, 1 o'clock, you are done. And we will go through father's rights next day. Father's rights, I have to put in quotes.